You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Tuesday evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my show, the Intrepid radio program. I'm Scotty Roberts, your host, and you're listening via Odyssey Radio Network. And if you want to go hear the audio, you can go to odyssey1.com, ODYSY1.com, or come on over and see the simulcast of this broadcast as it's happening over on my YouTube channel. Join the live chat room there with the rest of the Intrepids, and you can join us at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. You know, sometimes in radio, you're trying to always find ways to say things cogently with a good voice, and that's where I get held up sometimes. I'm like, wow, is my brain on today? Am I working today? I sometimes stumble over my own name and the name of my own show. So you're going to have to take that in stride as you listen to my stuff. That's one of my things. I try to get away with get that out of my lexicon altogether, and I haven't been able to wipe it out yet. Comes up when you're stumped for what to say next, what's supposed to come out of your mouth next, or your mouth is working faster than your brain, which happens to me an awful damn lot. So if you experience that, then cut me a little slack in that area. Let's move on. Today, there's so many things I want to talk about. I'm going to pick up with what we left off on yesterday, but there's so many things I could talk about and so many things I want to talk about. I want to do some book reviews for you. I was talking to my young son this morning on the way to school, and he's 10 years old. My daughter was in the back. She was pretty quiet this morning. She's 7, going on 8, and I read to them all the time, but it seems in the last year, the reading has started to take a back seat to other things. We used to read every night at bedtime, and we would read chapter books that would sometimes take us a month to get through because we were reading every night and reading so everybody could enjoy it. Maybe a chapter, maybe 2 chapters a night, depending on the length. My son loved the reading. We read books like, we read The Hobbit. We read John Carter of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. What a great book. My son really enjoyed those, even though there was some older language in it, as those were written about 100 years ago, almost 100 years ago. He really enjoyed the books. We read books that I've recommended on this show before. My only point I'm making with this is that we had dropped the habit of doing that. I went away last year to work for about 5 months out of town, and so I was gone for most of 5 months. Even though we talked online, we didn't read books online, and we really fell out of the habit of doing that. And my wife, having been reduced to a single parent during those months, found it easier to sometimes get the kids to bed by just playing nature shows on TV and letting them fall asleep and so on. And so we fell as a family out of reading and out of that habit. And it's something I was asking my son about again this morning. I said, we really need to get that going again. Did you enjoy that when we did it? Yeah, I enjoyed that. And so we got to get that going again. But let me ask you, do you read to your kids? I think reading is an important thing. Sometimes we let the TV do all the entertaining of our kids, and we use it sometimes to take up the time so kids can get out of our hair and let us get things done. Half of the problem my wife and I have is that when we're here in the office and we're working on things, it's every 2 minutes we have a child coming in. It's like they take shifts. Okay, I went in, now it's your turn to go in. Every 2 minutes, somebody comes in and wants to interrupt, has something they want to ask, has some need that has to be done. Will you tie this for me? Will you undo this for me? Will you draw with me? Will you do this? And we're just trying to get other things done. And so the reading has been one of the things that has fallen by the wayside. And I want to reinstitute that because I've always read to my kids. I read to my, as you know, I have older kids that are grown and out of the house. And I read to those kids. And once you fall out of the habit of doing that, it's been refilled with other things, it's hard to get back into that mode. But if it's important, you find a way to do that. And I think that reading to our kids is something that's very important because they hear our voice doing it. They hear us explaining things in the book if they don't understand something and ask a question. It's their time to sit with mom and dad and listen to something being read to them. It involves them in literature. It involves them in wanting to read stories on their own. So it's instilling something in them. And then the things we read, I like to choose books that I think my kids are going to enjoy, but that I also enjoy and that have values in them that I want to instill in my kids. I've talked on this show about having read books like To Kill a Mockingbird to my children. We read about a chapter, sometimes 2 chapters a night of that book, and it took us a couple of weeks, I think, to read that book. And some of the younger child, the 4-year-old, she'll fuss a little bit or kick around and then fall asleep. The middle daughter tends to fall asleep very easily. My son was very involved in these stories, and I think the middle child to a certain extent. And that book had certain values I wanted my kids to know and appreciate, and I pass on to them, so I would explain things to them and as we read. And so I think it's an important thing to do, and I think that ties in that little experience I had with my son this morning of just talking about reading again, picking that back up, making the time for it. Guys, if you've got kids, time is so precious and so valuable, and it's eaten up so quickly that we sometimes don't have time for principles. I ain't got time for principles. I don't have time to do that thing. We just got to get the task done. We got to get everybody fed. We got to get everybody watered. We got to get everybody's teeth brushed. We got to get everybody in bed. All the things that, if you've got children, and we've got 3, all 10 and under, when you've got that kind of hoard, sometimes time is very valuable. And by the time you get to bed, you're about ready to fall off the edge of the planet. And so it's finding a way to make that happen, to build in something that is special and important for your kids, and letting them see that you're building that time for them. What I'm proposing, the kids go to bed between 8 and 8:30. So what I'm proposing now is that we go back to what we used to do. At 7:30, it's family reading time. We sit down and read a book together. And usually it's let's crawl into bed, let's everybody put their jammies on, everybody listen, we're going to read a book at 7:30. So at about 7:15, you start the process of herding wild cats and getting them into their pajamas, getting them to brush their teeth, etc. And so, and sometimes that just doesn't happen. You get a busy life. Like last night, we had scouts last night, but then my 2 little daughters had cheerleading. My wife signed them up for cheer at the high school and for the little kids classes. And so we were out until we didn't even get home until 8 o'clock last night. So what happens to any kind of mentally established reading time at 7:30? It goes out the window. And so everything revamps. And we're busy like that. It seems my kids aren't even in high school. They're all in grade school. And we've already got evening schedules to rival any family with teenagers in high school. So finding the time is the important thing. And as the old saying goes, we all find time to do the things we want to do. So we've got to find ways to make that happen, even if there are times where you have other things that get in the way. And so I'm going to try to reestablish with my kids, and I encourage you to do something like this with your own kids if you've got them at home, is find the time to read to them. Find the time to make that important thing happen. And this can cross over into our topic. We're talking about kids and spirituality. And how do we pass spirituality onto our kids? How do we instill in them a desire to want to know these things? Things that become second nature to them. Are they... Michael R., if you're in the chat room tonight, you had made some statements last night about kids and parents doing things, and that kids need to see us do things and model things. I don't remember your exact quote on that, Michael, but this is what I'm talking about. Instilling spirituality in kids is something that, I know what you said. You said all kids are born with spirituality. And let's put quotation marks around that, because they can't define that. It's just part of who we are as human beings. And guiding that, giving them a compass, is what we have to do as parents. And sometimes we forget about instilling that compass when we are so overrun by the externals of life, the externals of family life. Happens here. And I know it happens for you guys. Now, many of you who listen to this show don't have kids at home, or you're not married. But these are, I think, universal principles that can apply. If you don't have kids, there are still things you can be doing to nurture your own spirituality, making time for it. I used to say when I would do a lot of tarot reading, there was a card that talked about, it was the Hierophant, and there was another one that talked about seeking guidance. And sometimes when you weren't looking to someone else, it was seeking the guidance inside. I remember many times I would get a progression of cards for people that would show up saying, you need this Hierophant, you need to seek good counsel, good advice on a spiritual nature for yourself. But it was also mixed with another card that said you need to make time for yourself. You need to take a break. You need to take time out. And many times that interpreted as you need to take time for yourself. You need to meditate. Try meditation or prayer, or whatever it is your spirituality leads you to do. I think meditation is a good thing. Electra last night said something about meditation is good for kids. Now, I have a tough time viewing my kids as sitting and being meditative. My 4-year-old cyclone of a little daughter, especially. But we can show them how we do it. Same with my other kids. I've got one kid that maybe, of my 3 little ones, that could be contemplative and be meditative. But do our kids understand what meditation is? What it means to pray or to meditate or to take that time. And maybe you who don't have kids and don't have a spouse or a partner in life, maybe what you need to do is look at yourself and say, do I take time to do that? Do I meditate? Or is your whole life a meditation because there's nobody else around? And you just spend your time in your own quiet and doing stuff. You see where I'm going with the point. Let's get back to the point, though. As parents, we need to instill these things in our kids. And let me get specifically to a point that I was talking about yesterday. I was talking about these strategies for raising a spiritual child. And let me re-ask some of the questions I asked last night. Now, you ask yourself this. If you're a parent with kids that you still have at home, that you're trying to instill values into, working at instilling values into, do you want your child to grow up to be resilient? Somebody who can bounce back easily. Somebody who can take the hits of life and go, well, that's life. I'm really disturbed by that. I'm disappointed by that. I have a problem with that. That thing's maybe caused situational depression, whatever it might be. Have you raised your kids to be resilient, to be able to bounce back from things? Have you role modeled that? Let me hit a hot point. And this is barely getting onto the topics I wanted to get into, but it's sidelines. Let me ask you this. Have you ever argued with your spouse in front of your children? I know I have. And sometimes we've had some kind of knockdown drag-outs that end up in a little boisterous yelling or bombastic. And it's not because we hate each other and want to do damage. It's that we both, as individuals, want to be heard. We both want to get our point across. We both interrupt. We both cause problems sometimes in the way we communicate with each other. And our kids see that. And if you think your kids don't see that, guys, you got another thing coming. They see that. And so our kids learn to argue and learn to fight based on how they see that role modeled. Now, so what we always try to do, and we're not perfect on this, God knows, we always try to show our kids that we love each other and we make up after a fight. And, I'll go, I know sometimes the kids are like, they're kissing again. Don't touch mom. Don't hug them. You're hugging dad. And all of those things. But kids need to see that. If you argue and you fight, they need to see that. And by fighting, I'm not talking about abusive stuff. I'm not talking about slapping and hitting and knocking down and punching. I'm not talking about abusive situations. I'm talking about normal arguments that couples have. If your kids see that, then your kids also need to see how you make up. That's resilience. You come back from problems. You revive from problems. You resurrect from problems. Do you want your kids to grow up and be resilient like that? That they know how to come back from things that are setbacks? Do you want your child to have a sense of awe and a deep sense of empathy, of caring for other people? I know, and I'm bragging a little bit here, my older daughters, my twin daughters, who are now 27, one thing I noticed about them growing up, I was a single dad from the time they were 10 years old. And they grew up with me, and they lived with me full time, along with their little brother. And I found in my daughters people who would go out of their way to be empathetic to others and couldn't understand and were mostly flummoxed by the fact that other people around them weren't that way, weren't empathetic. And so we talked through those things all the time, and we worked through those things. And they grew up, and they're fabulous entrepreneurs, and they do things that, in a sense, creates magic for other people. This is who they are. This is what they've become. Do you raise your kids with a sense of awe, a sense of wonderment? We talked yesterday about Carl Sagan, how he said his parents not only instilled a need to understand the scientific method, but to also never lose a sense of wonder for the universe around them. Do you want your kids, when they're a little older, teenagers, do you want them to not use drugs, to not engage in unprotected sex, to not be depressed? You know, you have a lot of control over that. You have a lot of say in that, in your kids' life, by how you raise them and what you teach them to do with their spirituality. Do you want your child to be optimistic and have a sense of belonging and peacefulness? Optimism. That seems like a lost thing nowadays. It doesn't just come naturally. There are optimistic people. I'm a fairly optimistic person, but I try to balance it with realism. And sometimes I can work myself into a pretty discouraged state if I'm not careful. And I have to just bring back the optimism and say, you know what? It's whatever mode you use, whatever method you use. Are you teaching your kids and role modeling optimism, a sense of belonging to each other, of peacefulness, contentment we talked about last week? Do you want your children to be self-controlled, grateful, and happy? Do you want your teenagers interested in making a better place even though they don't get anything in return? Those are the things we talked about yesterday. Hopefully they felt a little fresh tonight. So, in a spirituality sense, you can encourage your child's spirituality when you, one, avoid overindulging them by not giving them too much, by doing things for children that they should be doing for themselves. and by setting responsible rules and requiring children to do chores. That sounds so damned old-fashioned, doesn't it? But you know what? Kids need chores. One of the problems we have in our household is we have done lots of things for our kids. Our kids get lots of stuff because we like giving them stuff. Every time we go to places like the Goodwill or garage sales, they always get something. We rarely go out and buy new big toys and stuff, but they get a lot of stuff. We buy them a lot of books. We buy them a lot of junk toys. And you know what ends up? Those kids expect to get that. And so we instilled something in them that we are now fighting to correct. Because in all good intention, we ended up instilling in them a value that they get something for nothing. And so we've really been implementing the chores. My son is 10. He's getting pretty good at it. My daughter, 7, she's starting to get it. The 4-year-old is the total princess of the house. And believe you me, she believes she's the queen of the house. But she is also, when we give her the opportunity to do chores, sometimes when we're working along with her, she is right there to try to help. And she's one of the most helpful little people I know. But then she'll get forceful about it too and try to make you let her do everything. You're cooking or something. I want to do that. No, you can't do that. So you get the picture. So don't overindulge your kids. There's a relationship between childhood overindulgence and spirituality, or the lack of it. Adults who were overindulged as children grew up to feel entitled to more of everything that they think that they deserve. And they're not interested in spiritual growth. They have difficulties finding meaning in times of hardship. And they're less apt to develop a personal relationship with a power that they believe is greater than themselves. This is the one we covered yesterday at the end of the show. And so that was number 1 on these 7 ways to, or strategies you could call them, to raise a spiritual child. And of course, we're bumping up at the end of the first segment here. And so I just want to let you know we're going to move next into noticing your child's spiritual questions and experiences. Does your child have any spiritual experiences? Do they question you? Do you allow them to question? Do you find ways to help answer them rather than brush them off? This can cross into teenage years too. So let's talk about that one when we get back. Sit there for 2 minutes, and we'll be right back. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, from that break. Thanks for hanging on. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com to go hear the audio and go see all the different outlets where you can find this show, as well as some terrestrial stations across the nation. And also, come on over to my YouTube channel and watch the simulcast. Join the other Intrepids and join the chat room. You know, there's a lot of people that come over and watch the video that don't join the chat room. You're welcome to come in, join the chat room, state your piece, give your opinions, ask questions, and everybody else is in there to do the same. That's over on youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. So let's carry on where we left off. This is why I don't always get through all the material. I like to talk too much, but that's why I do radio. So number 2 in this list of, we were going through a list of 7 things that you can do, 7 strategies for raising a spiritual child. And you've got to consider that spirituality is an inner sense of relationship to a higher power. And not just that, but the sense of relationship to yourself and how you view yourself. The word that we give to this higher power might be God. It might be nature. It might be spirit. It might be the universe, the creator, things like that, or other words that represent a divine presence. But the important point is that spirituality encompasses our relationship and dialogue with this higher presence. And this is what we're talking about here. How do you instill these things into your kids? So number 2, which we ended at the end of the last segment, was notice your child's spiritual questions and experiences. Does your kid ask you questions about spirituality, about God, about the universe, about how things work, about why is the grass green and the sky blue? These are all spiritual experience questions. Do your kids have experiences that they ask you about? Everyone has questions relating to spirituality, even when you're grown and old like I am. And so even your children have these questions. If you ignore your child's questions, they'll assume the topic is off limits or not important. And that is an important blunder that a lot of we parents make. Oh, let's talk about, I don't have time to talk about that right now. We'll get to that. You brush them off. You don't take the moment. Sometimes teaching moments are in the moment, not when you schedule to do it later or when you're not too busy to answer the question. I'm guilty of that. I could be in the middle of something. I'll sit and I'll be drawing, and I'm intensely into doing something. And my child comes up and wants to ask me a question. It's not always on a spiritual level or experience level, but they'll ask me and I'll go, hey, Daddy can't talk to you right now. I'll get right back to you. Let's talk about that later. And we treat them like people on phone calls or in business. I'll get back to you on that. But kids need to learn in the now. That doesn't mean you can't turn to your child and say, that's an important question. I want to hear what you have to say, but I can't talk to you right now. Daddy can't talk to you right now. Can we talk a little bit later about that? I've done that with my kids too, which is the happy medium between the brush off and the digging right into it. So your kids want your attention. They learn that role models spirituality for them right there when you give them the attention that they deserve and that they need to answer their questions. And like I say, way back when I was in seminary, in my seminary days back in the early 1980s, we used to sit around and talk, all we seminarians, and we used to, as immature or as blasphemous as someone might think it was, if we were talking about something where we knew we were guilty of the same thing, we do this. We'd make what we consider to be the ground symbol in electrical work. We'd ground ourselves for the lightning bolt. It's like, okay, I'm going to talk to you guys about lust and lusting after other women. Oh, let me put up my, I don't want to get the lightning bolt, you know? And so this is the way I feel about this is I'm not perfect with this stuff, but it's stuff I really try to do with my kids. And something we as a couple, my wife and I, try to do with our kids. And it's not always convenient, folks. Trust me, having kids and being there all the time and in the moment with them is not always easy to do. And sometimes you got to brush them off. Sometimes they're being petulant. Sometimes they're being, what's the word for kids that, I think it's a P word. I can't think of precocious. You can, sometimes the kids need to be a little brushed up and say, go do your own thing because I'm doing my thing. We'll do this later. So my point is, are you there to take your kids' questions? And as much as you can, put it in the here and the now. Make it part of the now. And otherwise, they might end up assuming that the topic, if you never get back to it, is something that's unimportant. And a few questions your child might ask you, and might be some of these questions that you encounter. How about this one? Why do bad things happen to good people? You know, we hear of somebody's, and I will admit, this was a negative for me a long time ago, but it was another notch on the stick, so to speak. But I had friends many years ago, we're talking 30 years ago now, that had twin babies, and those babies were ill from birth, and they weren't sure if the newborns were going to live. And the whole church I was part of all gathered together at the hospital, prayer vigils, pleading with God to do something to save these children. And of course, as it turned out, it didn't happen. Those kids died. And the lesson you learned from that was, you know, maybe no is an answer as well. If you're a believer in God and that God controls these things, maybe God says there's a reason for it, and we don't always understand it. Maybe there is no reason. Maybe the lesson to be learned is that this is what life is. Sometimes things like this happen. Why do good people suffer bad things? I know for me at the time, it made me push away a little bit, because I was always taught biblically the fervent, effectual prayer of righteous people avails much before God. And if you have the faith the size of a mustard seed, you could move a mountain. All these biblical passages would come up. And then you run into crises like this, and prayer and faith didn't seem to matter. It didn't change anything. Did it draw the people together? Sure. Maybe that's the whole purpose of it. But at the time, it made me push away from God, saying prayer doesn't achieve much. And so when I talk about prayer and meditation, I do it with a little bit of, I don't pray. I rarely pray. The object of who I'm praying to is lost on me sometimes, many times, most of the time. But I do meditate, and I try to connect with the universe and so on. These are the ways you can teach your kids to deal with some of these questions. Why do bad things happen to good people? How about the converse of that? Why do bad people seem to succeed and good people seem to fail? These are big questions from your kids. How do people feel gratefulness after suffering, particularly in difficult times? How do you feel grateful? How do you become resilient? How do you bounce back from those things? Kids want to know this. They may not ask it in those words, but it's like, how do I deal with this? Why don't people like me? Is there a God or a higher power? Kids don't usually use the term higher power, but they'll ask you, is there a God? What's my relationship and responsibility to the environment? I know that's a big political football right now that's out there. But I think beneath it all, when you clear all the muck away there is a responsibility. What's my responsibility to my environment? How can I be a good steward of what I've been given? What does it mean to be a conservationist? So what happens to you after you die is something kids ask. I remember my wife's grandfather died a couple of years back, and the whole family was gathered. He had suffered dementia from Alzheimer's and had just degraded to the point he was lying in the reclining easy chair in the living room, and the whole family, there must have been 40 people, stuffed into that little house. And it was really a death watch. We knew he was going. And right there in front of us all, grandfather convulsed in the chair and shook and was still. And it was Rainey, my wife, who has had some medical training in... it's unimportant, but now that I started... she was an EMT at one point, before I knew her. And she went over and took his pulse and checked, and she said, yeah, he's gone. And my son Flynn, who was 8, I think, at the time, was standing very close to me in the kitchen. And this was all an open house, so the living room blended right into the kitchen. And he's standing right next to me and watched all this in silence. And he got very close to me. And just sunk his head against my chest as he was watching what was happening. And he asked those questions. What happens after you die? Dad, are you going to die someday? How old will you be when I'm your age? And because I had him later in life, he said, when I'm your age, how old will you be? And I did the math, and I said, well, when you're 56 years old, I'll probably be 106. I said, most likely I'm not going to be here. And I said, son, there's going to be a day where I'm going to be gone. I said, it could be a month from now. It could be 10 years from now. It could be 50 years from now. Should I live so long? And he was very quiet, but he started to gain this understanding of what happens, not necessarily after you die, but he started to come to terms with that death happens. And, of course, the inevitable questions. Where do you go after you die? And we're still dealing with that one. Why is there poverty and suffering in the world, your kids might ask you? Why are there starving people? What's the relationship between science and religion? That's going to come up soon enough. And it might not be in those words, but it might be, hey, we learned this thing in school today about this, and why doesn't that sound the same as this? And what's the meaning of life? There's a question. If you've got an answer for that, you can type it in the chat room. How would God want us to respond to aggression and terrorism? How should we, as people, respond to these things? So these are the kinds of questions you're going to get. And have you worked on developing your child's spirituality so they know how to deal with these kinds of questions? We may not have the answers to all of these things. Certainly we don't. If we did, we'd be the world-renowned guru, wouldn't we? The idea is teaching your kids how to ask those questions, what to do with their questions, how do they deal with themselves in light of these questions that there aren't sometimes very many answers to. We could have a political answer to things. That doesn't answer a kid's spiritual question. So the big question is, do you notice your child's spiritual questions, the things they experience? Bullying was one I left off there. Sometimes your kid asks you, like I said earlier, why don't people like me? Why do people bully me? Why do people push me around? Conversely, I have asked my son, why do you push your sister? Do you know that's bullying when you know you're bigger and stronger than she is? Let's talk about that. Why do you do that? What's on your mind? So that's a question you have to deal with. Your child's questions. So the third thing is encourage your child's spiritual discovery. Oh, how can you do that? I know we take our kids to the museum. We encourage scientific discovery. We encourage intellectual discovery. My son, I asked him this morning, just one of the age-old questions that parents ask sometimes when your kids are just sitting being quiet. You're trying to spark a little conversation. We're riding to school, which is about a 15-minute drive. And I said, son, what do you want to be when you grow up? I said, I know all these things you like to do. I said, you're 10 years old. I said, you ever thought about what you want to be? He goes, I don't know. Typical answer. But then he came out with a paleontologist. I want to be a paleontologist. Now, I have noticed in my son, he's quieter. We went to the museum, and while we're all, and this is when my older kids were up as well, and all of us went to the museum last year, and in St. Paul, the big science museum. And there's a million things to look at and see. What does my son do? He got trapped and would have stayed there the whole time, self-trapped, I should say, in the paleontological section, where they could chip away at real deposits that the museum brought in for kids to chip away at and try to find things in them. And that thoroughly, he gets engrossed by that. And he's way beyond a kid's love of dinosaurs, but it's now morphing into an interest in this. He knows I like archaeology. I watch a lot of archaeology shows, talk about archaeology. I've got all kinds of artifacts from Egypt and things like that, and other places down in Honduras and he sees this stuff and he asks questions. Paleontology is just a different version of archaeology for him. So, do you encourage your children's spiritual discovery? I've just spent a few minutes talking about scientific discovery and educational discovery. What about their spiritual discovery? Spiritual development takes encouragement. Take every opportunity to support your child's spiritual discovery. You don't have to agree with your child. You simply need to be interested, curious, open to their exploration. Developmental opportunities abound. These can be called psychologically formal operations, beginning around age 12, and that lasts into adulthood and all through adulthood. This is a stage in which your child begins to think abstractly, if and then and what if type of thinking. And so I'm seeing it in my 10-year-old, just starting to sparkle in the background there. They've gone beyond just the accumulating of toys and playing and all the things that kids do, and like a sponge starting to soak up these questions about spirituality, about knowing what to do beyond, what lays beyond the physical stuff around us. And you have to be there. You don't always have to agree. You don't always have to have the answers. You just have to be there to listen. Be there to listen, to respond, to give input. And do you take the opportunity when it comes, as we talked about earlier, to give your child this time? So how do you instill spirituality in your kid? You give them your time. It's the whole quantity versus quality question. I know back in the 80s it was really big to say, well, I don't have a lot of quantity for my kids, but I have quality time I give them because we're so busy. Well, kids actually need quantity more than they need quality. They need quality too, but your kid wants you. They want you to be there. That's one of the greatest things. When I was gone last year for several months and working out in Utah, I took a job thinking that it would help really line the coffers, and it really didn't. It was a waste of my time, and it hurt my family. But my kids need to see my time. They need to see me. My wife is better at this. When I was infirmed after surgeries and stuff and recovering, and I'm still have a tail end of that coming up, I don't have the physical stamina to get out and do some of the things I used to do with them. So my wife does them, and I end up just not coming along because of the way I feel. And so I have found that quality time, I have to pick up that slack in other areas. Maybe it's reading to my kids, which we started off with tonight. Maybe it's other things. So quality time, they want your time. You brush off your kid, you know what? Your kid will brush you off later in life. I always said, I am raising my children to want to have me around when I'm old. And that might sound selfish, but you know what that means? It means I'm raising my children to want to be around me. I'm raising my children to love what I offer them, to know that I am there to hear them out, to answer their questions, to do things. And many times we get so wrapped up in the hubbub and the wildness of the days, we don't take any time to do that. And so that is what our kid needs to help instill spirituality in them. Number 4 of these 7 things we're talking about, honestly answer your children's questions. Be honest about it. We feed a child's cognitive growth by allowing them to ask their questions. And you might not know the answers to many of the questions your child asks. However, a curt, I don't know, or nobody knows the answer to that, almost comes across as, there, I gave you a quick answer, now get out of my face, I don't want to talk about that. That shuts down the conversation. And discussing these challenging questions that kids have is key to your child's spiritual development. Let them know you're there. Being there is the, there's this thing, I'm not going to look for it right now. I'll bring it up in another thing, and we talked about it before, the 5 things from the fish philosophy that was meant for business and motivation, and it was through the Pike Place Fish Market in Seattle, or Portland, I think it is. Seattle? Portland. Somewhere out there on the left coast. And it was a philosophy they built 20 years ago into business structure and managing business. One of them, the key points, and I mentioned this before, was being there. And so are you just there for your kids? Are you there, or has life become too busy? Too busy making dinner, too busy cleaning the house, too busy, which gets to, are you instilling spirituality in them by giving them things to do, underindulging them, giving them chores, helping them develop a sense of their responsibilities? So discussing challenging questions is going to be a key to developing your child's spirituality, what they believe, where they want to be, where you want to see them go. And it's not necessarily instilling in them what you want them to be. You will be this. It's giving them that open ability to ask questions and do things. Number 5 is base your affection and your discipline on values that are aligned with the spiritual values of unconditional love. We've heard this a million times before. The old, this is going to hurt me more than it does you when I spank my kids or reprimand them, that's the truth. I hate disciplining my kids. Doesn't mean I don't. I'm very strong at discipline and sometimes strong at punishment. I will tell you a secret, folks. I believe spanking is an okay thing to do. And my kids have experienced that. But I also think it has its time and place. You can't spank for everything. There are reasons for it. And there are times where you shut it down and use other forms of discipline. I know it's been said that after a kid is 5 years old, a swat on the butt is almost inconsequential. You have to use other modes after that. And this is the challenge. Anybody can swat their kid on the butt and say, shape up. But not everybody knows how to give their time to their kids, how to show them unconditional love. I'm disciplining you, but I love you through this whole process. And so all parents give both affection and discipline to their children. Well, for the most part. I've seen parents that don't. It's important that you're consistent and that these processes are in tune with your own spiritual values. Remember, what you sow is what you reap. So if you sow anger into your kids, you're going to reap anger from your kids. You don't want to develop angsty kids. You want to develop resilient kids who know how to turn into their spirituality when they have questions. 6 is make spiritually supportive communities available so children can discover their own identity and be accepted. We've got our kids in scouting. Great values there, but I find that sometimes it just doesn't give what I was hoping it would give. There are places you can connect with your kids, be it a church, be it a lodge, be it other forms like that, where your kids can learn values about their spiritual. So far, I haven't seen our scouting efforts really turn around a spiritual introspection in our kids. That bothers me a little bit. And so I want to make sure that what we do connects them to things. As your child begins to wrestle with spiritual questions, it's important for you to listen to them. Answer as honestly as you can. And more so, it's helpful for you to find a supportive spiritual community of some sort where your child feels welcomed. Now, the 7th thing, and we've got really less than a minute, I'll just mention it. Encourage value and model non-materialistic values and behaviors. There's a negative relationship between materialism and spirituality. And so it's important for we as parents to encourage and model non-materialistic values to our kids. This will be a challenge in an overindulgent society, the one that we live in now. Problems of the first world, as we say. Parents often reward their children with things, toys, phones, iPads, etc. And I'll give you a secret. We just bought iPads for Christmas for the kids. But those are the things we reward our kids with for being good. And conversely, parents take away things when the child misbehaves. If this strategy is used excessively to shape children, it fosters materialistic values that undermine a child's spirituality. So you know what? Giving and taking away things is a bad way to shape values in your kids. And so all of this, we're out of time. I'm going to pick this up one more night tomorrow night and develop this, evolve this a little bit more. So think about these things. Think about the ways and the strategies you can use as you raise your kids or raise yourself if you don't have any kids. You sit tight. We'll be back after 23 hours. Thanks for being here. See you tomorrow night.